Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us in this session. Now we have 7 Sanity Savers Avoid Being Tied to Your Power Query Forever by Kathryn NEWITT.
Hi, my name is Kathryn NEWITT and I'm a Senior Manager at SumProduct. If you've read my profile, you'll see that I spent many years as a programmer in a software house. So when I look at Excel, Power Query and Power BI, I tend to look at it from the perspective of a programmer. When writing programs, it's important to remember that someone else is going to have to work out what the code means. So not only should it do what it's supposed to do, but you should also be able to see what it's actually doing. If other programmers don't understand your work, then what will happen is you'll end up having to maintain your program forever, which is what gave me the idea for this session. 7 sanity savers, how to avoid being tied to your Power Queries forever. So in this session, I'm going to start off by considering why being indispensable is not necessarily a good thing, and then go on to look at 7 tips. The tips I'm going to look at are name to explain, running commentary, a place for everything, taking smaller steps, one question at a time, coding shouldn't be hard, and change of function, and then I'm going to summarize at the end. So let's get started. Why shouldn't we be indispensable? So why not be indispensable? It might seem like a great idea if you're the only person that understands your highly complex query, but sometimes you might want to take a day off or go on holiday. And what happens then? So imagine the situation. You're sitting there getting on with your work thinking, half an hour till lunch, and then your boss comes over. Dave's on holiday. Yep, he is, yeah. Well, he's created a query and it extracts data from our tent database and creates this little table. Great. So could you just quickly, before you go to lunch, just have a look and see if it includes the delivery charge? Yeah, that sounds okay. I mean, it's a nice table. Got a little button and everything, I'm sure. Dave's made a great job of it. Yeah, sure. So off you go. Into the query. Right, let's find where it's, yeah, what does that do? Yeah. Well, we have 2 choices here. Either you're not going to lunch for a while, or Dave's going to get a call on his holiday. Anyone got Dave's number? Poor Dave. And that's the problem. Writing amazing queries is only half the job. You need to make sure that everyone else understands what your query does too. Otherwise, not only can you not go on holiday, but when you've not looked at your query for, let's say, 6 months, how are you going to know how to fix that? And not only holidays, you also want to be promoted at some point. You don't want to have this query hanging around your neck for the rest of your career. So, how do we make the query easier to understand? Let's take a closer look at that query. Now, if you're familiar with Power Query, you might think, well, we could just go to the advanced editor. And that's true, we can go to the advanced editor. But it's still not much easier to see what's going on. In fact, the only clue is this word delivery. So that's where you'd go to and try and work out what's going on. But if Dave actually ever wants to take another holiday again, or wants to be promoted, or ever leave the company, or in fact do anything else other than look after this particular query, then it would be a good idea if Dave made it a bit easier to understand. So what changes could we make to make this easier to follow? So this brings me to my first tip, name to explain. You have to give queries names, so why not make them useful? There's not much point having a misleading name, like this example we have here, beware of the dog. Yeah, I don't think she's that scary. I know she's not that scary, she's my dog. So let's go back to Dave's program and see how we can name to explain what he's actually trying to achieve. Well, for a start, the queries could be renamed so we can actually see what they're doing. So let's start with that. I can look at the data to see what's actually contained in each query and then double click to rename the query to something a bit more sensible. It's important when renaming queries that you know whether or not they're in the data model, as you will get a warning about whether or not you should actually be renaming your query, as you can see. And I'm just repeating this process for the other queries too. Similarly, some of the column names here are a little bit misleading too. I'm not sure what count is. We seem to have male and female here, although that's clearly not what it is. So we will go and rename some of these column names just to make it a little bit easier to follow what's going on. This is clearly meant to be an amount. So we'll change this to amount. As you'll see later, there's other places we can do this, but we'll name it here for now so we can see what's going on. It's also a good idea to check the data types, make sure they fit with the data. And I think we should probably move this feet column along the end here so that it goes with meters. But rename these two, make them a bit clearer what's going on. And then finally, our custom column at the end here should really have a better description. So now we're going to move on to the step names. And as you can see, we have a lot of steps and many of them have got generic names and the names are repeated. So we're going to look first at expanded new column. That's not very descriptive. I can right click and I can rename it. And I'm going to call it extract group. Now this makes sense because if I go to the source step and then have a look at what we're doing, we're actually extracting the group from the table to create item group. So that does make sense. However, there's another thing that you need to bear in mind when you're renaming your steps. And that is, if we go to the advanced editor, we'll see that the source step is just written as it is, but for steps with spaces in, it has a hash and then speech marks. This tells Power Query to ignore the space. So if I create step names which don't have a space in, then I can achieve the same thing. There's a couple of ways of doing this. I can use underscores like I have done with the query names, or I can use camel case, where we just have a capital letter for the beginning of each word. So I'm going to use camel case with this example. So I'm going to follow this principle for the other steps too. So for each step, I'm going to check what it does. So this is renaming new column item group to item group. And then I'm going to change the step so it reflects what's actually happening, remembering not to have any spaces. In this case, I will have an underscore in the name because the column that I'm renaming is item underscore group. Not every step requires a new name. In some cases, I just need to remove the space. For example, with sorted rows here. To see how these steps look now I've changed the names and removed the spaces, I can go back to the advanced editor and you can see that all the hashes and speech marks have disappeared for these steps, which is what we want because it makes it much easier to read. I just need to do the rest now. So we go back to our steps and we continue. Now the next step is quite important because this is where we deal with the delivery charges. So I'm going to rename this from a place value. And I'm going to look at what this step does, and we're replacing delivery with null. And then we're going to fill down. So this is where we're actually going to include the delivery and then group it. So this is an important step. We need to rename it. So we're going to call it remove delivery description. And this will make it easier to spot where the delivery cost is embedded. And the next step just fills down on description, so we can rename that. And then we're on to group rows, where we're going to do a couple of things. If we look at the little cog, we can see what we're grouping by. And we can see we're doing a sum of amount by description, but for some reason we're calling it count, which we don't need to do. So if we call it amount here, we don't need to rename this column at the end, which saves us a step. So we click OK here, and now we can move on to renaming this step. So rename this step to sum amount and split column by delimiter. We use the cog again to see what we're splitting by. And then we can rename this step too, with making it extract meters. Now the change type steps we can actually get rid of because we're going to do the change types at the end to get the correct types. There's not much point doing it all the way through unless we specifically need a type. If we're going to apply a particular type of calculation, for instance. But in this case, we can safely remove it. So now we're on to the very descriptive added conditional column, which of course we need to have a look what we're adding and then give it a proper name for this step. The best way to work out what these sorts of steps are doing is to look at it in conjunction with the data. So we've got description 2, and we can see the description 2 column, and we're looking if it's null, and then we're making the output description 1, and again we can see that at the top of the screen. So what we need to do is check what happens when they're null. So we can see that if it's null in description 2, we're using description 1. So we're actually fully populating the description column. So we're going to call it create description column. The next few steps are quite similar. So I'm going to use another Sanity saver and magically move forward in time. Now I've stopped here because renaming steps can reveal something else. And that's steps that are doing very similar things. I've got a couple of steps here that are removing temp columns and creating the description column. You could probably combine them so that you could have less steps in here, but it all depends how complicated this would make it to follow, because you don't want to make it more complicated. We're trying to give Dave a little bit of a break here, so you don't want to make his program even harder to understand. Having said that, I'm now going to go forward in time again to the end of this query. So here we have our newly named query. So we have order charges with group, which you've named properly, and then we have all our steps, which are all without spaces and hopefully mean a lot more. So that now if you were looking for the place where we're dealing with delivery, we'd be looking here where we remove the delivery description and then fill down description and then sum the amount. So we could work out what was happening there. So yes, delivery is included. And if we go and look at the advanced editor, it's now much easier to read. And we can see all the names without any hashes and any speech marks. However, what if we wanted to make a more complete description of something like sum amount, so that we know exactly what was going on? I'm glad you asked. This brings me to my next tip, running commentary. Not only can we make the names make more sense and give us more clues as to what's going on, we can actually put comments into the code and add descriptions and make it easier if we want to add things to specific steps that are slightly more complicated. So, how do we go about that? So let's look at how we can add some information about a particular step. We have some amounts here, and we can go to the applied steps and right click on some amounts and look at the properties. In here we can enter a description. Here's one I prepared earlier. The step sums the delivery charge with the cost of the item. Click OK. And you'll notice a little information icon appears, and we can hover over it and we can see what we've just entered. Now what this is actually doing is entering a comment for that particular step, and we can view that comment in another way in the advanced editor. So you can see we've got double forward slashes and then we've got our step, and this is another way of entering a comment where we can enter a single comment. So I could enter a comment, say before extract group, do 2 forward slashes, and then just say this extracts the group. And then we can click done. And now you can see we've also got a little information sign on extract group, which says this extracts the group. So can we enter more involved comments? Well, let's see what happens if I enter a comment against. Say we wanted to indicate that we'd quite like to combine some of these at a later date. I'm going to go into the properties for remove temp columns and say, ideally, we should combine this with, and then we're going to enter return, and we're going to say remove temp columns. We'll just say star, so we know that we mean all the other remove temp columns. So we've got 2 lines in this description. Click OK. Again, we can go to this little icon and we can see what it says here, and then we can go to the advanced editor, and it's actually created 2 lines this time. There is another way we could do this. Instead of creating 2 lines, what we can have is a beginning and end. So instead of 2 forward slashes, I can have a star here, and then I can also put a star at the end. So we'll just delete this double slash. Don't worry about all the red lines, we will get there. And then we put in a star and a forward slash. And now it recognises it as a comment. So this is another way we can have more than 1 line, and this can go on for several lines if we wish. So we can click done here. And we can still see the information is available here, but we've just entered it into the advanced editor in a slightly different way. It's also possible to embed comments within an actual line if we wanted to, although this can sometimes make it more confusing than it needs to be. So for instance, if we go to sorted rows, we can actually enter it into here. So again, we're going to use the method with the forward slash and the star. And we finish up with a star and a forward slash. That's actually embedded into the step. That obviously still works fine and is still recognised as a step. So now when we go back to that step, we can see our comments. So that's one way of putting comments in steps. If you had a comment at the end of the step, it tends not to be shown. I'll just show you by putting one on the end here. So I'm just going to put a comment at the end of here and see whether it likes this. So if we come back to it now, you can't see that comment anymore, because as a rule, Power Query tries not to show comments in the formula bar. So if you need to see your comment, then the best way was the way I just did before, where we had the always ascending to still in the middle. So that's how we enter comments against steps. So we can also enter comments against queries. If we right click, we've got properties here too, and we can put anything we like in here. So the comment I could also put in here is the same one as before. So instead of saying that, we can say this query sums the delivery charge with the cost of the item. So that'll be much quicker. We just have to go and look in here to answer Dave's query. This time you don't get a little information icon, but you do still see the comment when you hover over the query. So all we would have had to have done to answer the question about Dave's query would have been to come in here and hover over this. So Dave would have been enjoying his holiday and perfectly happy on the beach. Now we've looked at how we can make comments and expand on our descriptions. Another thing to consider when we've got lots and lots of queries is how we should actually organise them. And that's what we're going to look at next. There's a very old saying in the UK which goes, "A place for everything and everything in its place." It's meant to be the recipe for how you never ever lose anything again. And it can be applied to queries too. So let's have a look at how we can organise our queries so we never lose anything again. So I've expanded the queries pane here to give you an idea of what I mean. We've got a mixture of different queries, we've got a function, we've got a parameter, and everything's just lumped together in the order they were created. Now we can actually make this better. What we can do is, if you go to any query and right click, you can create a group. So we move to group, new group, and we can call this group orders. And this can be all queries pertaining to orders. Okay, and that immediately puts our query in the group orders and creates an other queries group as well. So what we can do now is we can either add things to this group or we can create new groups. So again, we'll do move to group orders. And within the group, what we like to do is we like to have things alphabetically. So this one's actually working alphabetically at the moment. So this makes it nice and easy to find things within the group. So I'm not going to make you watch me put everything into groups. Here again, by the magic of video, is how the groups are going to look. And here we are. We've now got a series of folders or groups. We've arranged these groups in alphabetical order, and because we added descriptions, we should be able to see the description when we hover over the group. So we can see all queries pertaining to customers. We just had functions as its own description because that was enough. All queries pertaining to groups and all queries pertaining to orders. If we open up each of the groups, we can see we've got our queries inside, also in alphabetical order, so that they're easy to find. So we can open all these up, see all our queries, all in alphabetical order within the group. Do note that the other queries can't be put into alphabetical order. It's always going to appear at the bottom, and it's always going to remain because this is where Power Query creates new queries. So that's always going to be at the bottom. So if we want to have a nice tidy screen, then we can close these up and just open the ones that we need open, which works very well when you've got a lot of groups because it means you can just have the ones open that you need. So we have a place for everything and everything in its place, and we're not going to lose any queries. Now we're going to take a closer look at how we construct our queries. Now at first, the next tip might seem a bit counterintuitive. After all, aren't we supposed to make sure our queries have as few steps as possible? Well, yes, but there are limitations to this. Let me show you an example. So, Dave's been taking our advice and he's taken back his query and adapted some of our changes. He's kept our query names and he's added a description. This adds in the delivery charge and strips out the dimensions. Lovely. And he's really simplified the number of steps that we need, and he's got lovely descriptions for each one. Get the data sorted, add in the delivery charge, well that's useful. Sort out the dimensions. Okay, well let's have a look at the steps then. So we've got final build. Let's see what this does. Okay, this is too big, Dave. What Dave's done here is combine all the steps. Now, there are times when it's a good idea to combine some of these steps. For instance, if you are making things simpler, or if you're working with a relational database and you want to have all the steps together that will create the select statement against your database if you want to do query folding. But really, if you want someone else to understand what's going on here, then the best thing is to keep to separate steps for separate functions. Because this is basically doing everything. You're renaming a column after removing other columns, after adding a column, after combining columns, after splitting a column. There's just too many things going on and it's too hard to work out. So if you're tempted to combine steps just so you can create something like this, please think twice about it, because although the end result looks easy to understand, if someone needs to change something, then it's a different story. So that's taking smaller steps within a query, but how much should we put in a query? With this tip, one question at a time, there's really no hard and fast rules, which is why I'm going to use an example to explain it, but in any case it will depend on your scenarios. If you do have a big complicated query and there is a logical way you could break it down, then it's definitely something to consider. However, you do have to balance this with any effects on loading times. Let's take a look at an example. So this is a different example, and as you can see, I have a folder called Ugly and a folder called Easier. Clues in the name. In the Ugly folder, I have Inventory Average Calc Ugly. Why is it ugly, you ask? Well, not only are all these steps very generically named, but there's an awful lot of steps. So if there's a problem in here, it's very difficult to see what's going on and where you should look for the problem. In the Easier folder, we also have Inventory Average Calc, but in here we've got some other queries as well, and these actually build up towards Inventory Average Calc. So if we go and look at Inventory Average Calc here, not only do we have step names which tell us what each step's doing, but if you look at the source, it starts off with Inventory Average Triangulated. which is the previous query in this list. So again, if we go and look at inventory average triangulated, we see that these also have names that explain each step, and the source for this is inventory amounts per day. So if we go to inventory amounts per day, again we have reasonably named steps which get us towards the amounts per day, and the final step is grouping our amounts. So each time we reach a sensible point, we take a reference copy and then add steps to that copy. And obviously the source for this is actuals, and actuals comes from our source data, so we're fine with that as a starting point, and actuals will probably be used somewhere else anyway. And that's the other point to keep in mind here. Not only should you be looking to break down your queries so that they're easy to understand, but if parts of your query could be used elsewhere in your model, then it's very useful to have them separate so you can use two reference queries and only change your logic in one place. And as I alluded to earlier, there is a balance to be had between breaking down your queries into enough small parts so they can be understood, and not breaking them down too far so that you're just creating a lot of extra queries that are just going to slow down your load time. So that's looking at how we should break down our queries. Next, we're going to look at what we actually put into our query. As a former programmer, I can tell you one thing we shouldn't be putting into our queries is hard coding. So, is hard coding the sign of a lazy programmer? Well, yes and no. It's fine to hard code values when you're creating your queries. You're still building them, they're probably going to change, you might need to alter things, so it's okay at this point. But before you release your queries into the big wide world, then you need to take any variables and make them parameters so that whoever uses the queries can easily change them. Also, if you have any fixed values, it's still a good idea to take them out and put them in a separate parameter, because then people can see where they are and what the values are far more easily, rather than looking through lots and lots of code. So as usual, we're going to look at an example where we've got some hard coding. For this example, we're going to look at a simple query called ratings. And as we can see from the steps, we've got our source, we assign a standard, which is here. We add a contact, if appropriate, which is here, Mr. Green. And then we change the types before we load it. So let's have a look at what we're actually doing. We start off with the source, which is basically a salesperson and then their satisfaction rating. Then we assign a standard. So if we look at the code for this step, we can use the cog. We're adding a conditional column, and we've got hard-coded values in here. Now really we should be using parameters here, because these values could change. So that's where we're going to start. So we'll cancel this, and we'll go to Manage Parameters on the Home tab, and we're going to create a new parameter. So parameter 1 is going to be, we'll call it P top grade. The P just indicates it's a parameter so we can find it. The top grade is always going to be a number. Okay, and you've got the option of a decimal number. And the value we're going to start with is 45. Okay, so we've created our first parameter. Add another new parameter. And this is going to be the adequate grade. So we're going to put adequate grade. Again, we don't need a description. This is also going to be numeric. So we can go with decimal number, and this is going to be 35. So we click OK again, and now we've got our two parameters. So we can go back to our query. So now we'll go to assign standard and use the cog. See our conditional column, and now instead of putting 45 and 35, we're going to use our parameters. So here we're going to select a parameter, and we're going to select the top grade. And on this one, we're going to again select a parameter and pick the adequate grade. Okay, and this should have absolutely no impact on our results. So we'll just check, and yes, still the only person who's in trouble is newbie. Now, the added contact step. The logic for this, again, we can use the cog. So if the standard equals requires intervention, then Mr. Green is the contact. Now, we don't know if this is going to change, but it's always a good idea, just in case, to have this as a parameter too. So we'll have Mr. Green as a parameter for the contact. It's also much easier to spot who the contact is if you do it this way. So we'll come out of here, back to manage parameters, and we'll create another new parameter. We'll call this one P contact, which will be set to text. And the current value is going to be Mr. Green. And again, we can go back to ratings, to the added contact step, and we can change this from being hard-coded to Mr. Green to select a parameter, and the parameter is P contact. And there we go. We've still got exactly the same results, but now we've got parameters here. And of course, since we have parameters, what we should do here is we should create a group for them. And then we can move our other parameters into the group. Just make sure, yes, they're in alphabetical order. So that's how we use parameters to avoid hard coding. Next, we're going to look at how to make functions easier to edit. And this particularly applies to functions that were created in a particular way, as I'll show in a moment. So this brings me to my final tip, which is change of function. And this applies to functions that were created by amending the code in the advanced editor the old-fashioned way. They can be updated to make it far easier for people that aren't that familiar with the advanced editor to be able to get at the code. Let's have a look. So to demonstrate this, we're going to use fn_salesperson. As we can see, we can't currently get access to any of the steps, perfectly normal for a function. So we need to go to the advanced editor in this case, because this is where it's been set up to be a function. So we can see we've got a parameter defined at the top, and then the parameters used within the steps of the function. So we need to create this, rather than having it internal to this particular query, we're going to create this as a parameter that anything can access. So if we come out of here, I'm going to take this, because I'm going to use this as the parameter name, make sure I get it right if I copy and paste. This is what a possible current value could be. So we just need to make sure we enter a date and then a time when we're doing the current value, because you have to put something in the current value. So we're going to go manage parameters, new parameter. Just going to paste in the name. We know it's a date time. We had a date time before. And then we're not going to suggest any values, but we're going to just put a current value of any date. So let's just do 01/22 and just a random time. There we go, it's accepted that. Don't worry when it comes up with warnings because it hasn't got the correct format yet. As soon as you've got the whole thing in, it's fine. So click OK. And we've created a parameter now. So now if we go back to FN salesperson, we're going to go to the advanced editor, and we're just going to get rid of this top line because this should already be recognized now. So we're just going to delete this, and now we've got a standard program now. So we're going to click done. And now you can see we can access steps here. So now we've actually got this as coming out with a value. So what we're going to do now is we're going to now right click on this. First of all, we're going to rename it, and we'll call it steps, function salesperson steps. And then we're going to right click on it again, and we're going to create function. And the function name is going to be fn_salesperson. Okay. And now we have our function and we have our steps. So if we want to change this, we change the steps here. If we try and look at the source for this, and it will warn me when I try and look at the source for this in the advanced editor, You see, now they're connected. So now the best way to change this function is by changing the fn_salesperson steps. Now this does create an extra function, so you could argue that if people know the advanced editor really well, you don't need to do this. But in the case where you've got people that don't always know how to understand M code in full and need the extra help with the steps, this is a good way to allow people to edit your functions. So this is my final tip. So this brings me to the end of my tips. We're going to go back for an overview. So let's summarize what we've been through. Why not be indispensable? Well, obviously you don't want to end up working on the same queries all the time, so it makes sense to make your queries easy to understand. Some tips for doing this were name to explain, where you take the time to make your steps and your queries more self-explanatory by thinking about what they're actually doing and expressing it in the title, and also making sure you use camel case or underscores so that you haven't got those hashes and speech marks that clog up the advanced editor. Running commentary. This is only for more complex or key steps. Please don't add comments for every step, but adding comments for clarity can really help people understand your queries. A place for everything, and everything in its place. It really does make it easier if you've got orderly query panes where you've got groups with similar queries and also everything in alphabetical order, so you know exactly where to go when you need to fix something. Taking smaller steps. Don't be tempted to overcomplicate individual steps just so that your applied steps pane looks more streamlined. Try and keep 1 or 2 functions to each step so that people can follow what's going on. 1 question at a time. Similarly, don't write huge queries if you don't need to. Try and break them down into logical parts. Sometimes you'll find that this is useful because you can reuse some of the parts as well. Coding shouldn't be hard. Please use parameters and don't put hard coding in. It's so much easier to see what's going on when you can spot the parameters and you can see the values in the query pane. Change of function. This is for those functions where there isn't a reference query behind them and you have to go into the advanced editor. If you amend them so that they reference another query, people can just follow the steps in that query rather than having to go into that advanced editor that everyone loves so much. So why are we doing all this? Well, the point of us all being here today is it's good to share. We want to learn from each other, and it's easier to do that if we can follow the M code in each other's queries, and then people can learn how to code just as well as you, and that helps us all. Thank you for watching. I hope some of these tips have been useful. If you have your own tips for writing better code, please feel free to share them. I've been Kathryn NEWITT for SumProduct. I hope you enjoy the rest of the presentations.
Thank you for watching this session. It was a great content, and please tell us how do you feel pleasant through this QR code or this link below. There you can share your thoughts, you can make questions that Kathryn will be more than happy to help you and answer your questions.